Welcome to Video Workbench Volume 1, Jet Aircraft, hosted by Chris Wilson. Please make sure you build only in a well-ventilated area. Protective eyewear and breathing apparatus should be used at all times.
Hi, I'm Chris Wilson, and I'll be your host on Video Workbench. In front of me is my MiG-29 Fulcrum in 132 scale. This model has won 7 awards, including first place and out of box at the IPMS Nationals in St. Louis. I've been going to model contests for 12 years, and I'm currently employed as a prototype model maker. I'm about to show you the various techniques I use to build my models, as well as give you some hints and tips at what judges are looking for at contests. I'll be using the MiG to demonstrate with, but you can use these techniques to make any jet aircraft look great and hopefully win some awards too. So let's begin. Now there are some must-have tools for hobbying, including hobby knives, sandpaper ranging from 220 to 1200 grit, wet or dry, an old toothbrush, various types of tape, including drafting tape, fine line automotive tape, Scotch transparent tape, post-it notepads, an airbrush, super glue and liquid cement, various sizes of brushes, including a dust brush, as well as bottle caps to help you mix your paint in, some needle files. Some other items that are nice to have include tweezers, an artist's inking pen, a scribe tool, as well as a steel ruler, a pin vise, drill bits, small drill bits ranging in size from 60 to 80. The punch and die set is useful for punching circles out of decal paper or plastic. Now I'm about to begin what I call the battle plan. You'll also need some reference material. Laid out in front of me, I've got several magazines that you can pick up at your local hobby shop. You can pick up videotapes at your hobby shops, as well as record stuff from TV, A&E, Discovery, PBS, all run good shows on aircraft. Air shows are a good source. Also have to choose a color scheme. This is partially dependent on what decals are available. For the MiG, I chose the Iraqi markings, and fortunately they were available. I've got in front of me my reference materials, which I've studied and familiarized myself with the aircraft. I've got the major pieces, which I'll be cutting from the trees and test fitting. I've got my instructions, which I don't recommend following the construction sequence there. Things like landing gear, tail cones, missiles, we'll save for a later point. What I want to do is construct the model to a point where it's ready to paint. I've got in front of me all the parts of the cockpit laid out. Got the instructions here as a reference. I've got my photos, reference photos from various sources. And I'm preparing the parts. As described earlier, I'm removing the mold seam that runs around all the parts. The sprue attachment points, we're removing those. I've gone ahead, spray painted 2/2 of an ejection seat black here. I'm going to demonstrate dry brushing using the black and some white. Come in and take some black, a little bit of white, put the white off to the side, and I want to lighten the black just a little bit. So I'm coming up with a dark gray shade. Now, take and dry the brush on a paper towel until you're getting very little paint sticking. So we've got an almost dry brush here. We'll come in and just hit the part lightly, and what this does, the paint sticks to the high spots, starting to lighten the higher spots. We'll let that dry for a few minutes and you'll be able to see the difference. This ejection seat has already been dry brushed. The cushions have been dry brushed with olive drabs going from dark to light. It's already been dull coated. The sides have been dry brushed from dark to light using the black and white. And we're ready to put seat belts on this seat. Now I'm going to be using watercolor paint. Got some black here, a little dab in a beer cap. I use the watercolor to pick out small details and lines. I like using watercolor because it's not permanent. If you make a mistake, you can clean it off pretty easily. Get a little bit and just touch it to a line and allow it to flow into the lines. I'm not worried about slop because it's watercolor, it's easily removable. I'll come in and remove that stuff in a moment. I'm getting a nice hard outline around all the gauges, instruments that otherwise would have to be carefully hand painted. This makes things much easier. Okay, I'm going to come in and clean off the excess watercolor paints using a damp Q-tip. Okay, now we've got the outlines of the gauges painted with watercolor black. Now painting the insides will be much easier. I'm coming in with black enamel. And we'll just fill in the blanks. Now I'm going to come in and paint the gauges with white, the numbers and dials. A little bit of white oil paint. I find that oil paint's easier to paint small details with because it stays wet on your brush longer. Just a little bit on the brush. Adding color to cockpits. When you look at photos of a cockpit, there usually isn't a whole lot of color, but you do need some. In this case, I've got some color photos, so I'm just going to match what's in the photo. A little dab of red here. Just a little bit of red, a little bit of color. Too much color usually looks kind of hokey. To simulate the glass over the top of the gauges, I'm going to come in, put a little bit of gloss coat on. In this case, I would say don't use any gloss you want. Definitely use something water-based so the gloss doesn't soften your lacquers, clear coats, and distort your detail painting. Okay, raised details. I use more or less a dry brush technique. I've got more paint on the brush than I would use for dry brushing. Come in and lay the brush on its edge, come across and pick out the highlights. Using a large brush, just moistened with a little bit of paint thinner. Come in and wet the surface. I'm coming in with a wash of gray oil, thinned with terpenoid. And I'm going to touch it to the corners and allow it to flow out. Just touching spots here and there and it'll connect itself. Now I'm going to dirty the cockpit up and add some shadows with chalk pastel. What I've got here is a stick of black chalk pastel. Using the edge of a knife, I'm going to scrape a little bit of powder off. Take some pastel and put it in where there would be shadow and dirt. This adds some life to an otherwise flat surface. The pastel should be applied over a surface that's been previously dull coated or a flat paint. They don't stick well to gloss paints. Now, fitting our painted cockpit tub into the fuselage, we see that the sidewall here looks blank. It's got some mold marks on it. It needs something. You also see the top around the instrument shroud looks thick and out of scale. So what we can do, come in, thin the edges of this with file or scrape it with an X-Acto until that's thin. We'll come in and sand this molding defects off the sidewall here and paint some detail on there. Now in here you see I've sanded the detail away on the sides come in and painted and penciled in. Small lines in here are actually just pencil lead. Put some detail in there. See, I've got my pastels, I've got my washes. The instrument panel, I've got the gauges glossed over. Already attached the control stick. I've got the shroud thinned. We're ready to go ahead and attach our ejection seat and do our finishing details along the outside surfaces. Now, because I built my MiG for out-of-the-box the IPMS Nationals, they don't allow any additions to the kit except for paper seat belts and paper seat belt buckles. No aftermarket buckles, no bent-up wire buckles.